Welcome to Scuba Diving with a Spinal Cord Injury, the podcast that explores the thrill, freedom, and challenges of diving with a spinal cord injury. Whether you're a diver, an instructor, or just curious about adaptive scuba, this podcast will bring you expert insights and essential safety tips. We'll talk about everything, from medical considerations and specialized equipment to real-life experiences from divers who have redefined what's possible. So strap in, take a deep breath, and let's dive beyond limits.
All right, diving in, folks. Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're going somewhere unexpected. Get this, scuba diving, but for people with spinal cord injuries.
Yeah, you wouldn't think it, right? But we got some seriously cool material to dig into. A full-on medical guide and, get this, research on the therapeutic benefits.
Hold on. Therapeutic benefits of scuba diving with an SCI. Okay, you've got to break this down for us. What sources are we talking about here?
Okay, so we're looking at Diving with a Spinal Cord Injury. It's a guide, version 1.1 by Dr. Mark Downs. Seems like the authority on this. And yeah, we also pulled some excerpts from research articles. It's getting fascinating.
Okay, I'm hooked already. But let's start at the beginning. What exactly are we aiming to do with this deep dive?
All right, so the goal is to really extract the gold from these sources,
Right.
Understand how scuba diving can actually be possible, and not just possible, but potentially beneficial for people with SCIs. But we got to be real, we're also going to look at the safety stuff, the essential support needed.
Yeah, safety first, always.
Yeah.
Our listeners are smart. They want to know the real deal, not just the hype.
Absolutely. So, let's jump in head first. Let's talk about what a spinal cord injury actually is, what it does to the body.
All right, foundation first. Spinal cord 101. Hit me with it.
Okay, so picture this. The spinal cord. It's like the body's main communication highway. This column of nerves running from the brain down the back. It's the messenger carrying signals both ways.
Signals like what?
Well, think about touch, temperature, pain. All those sensations travel up the cord to the brain.
Ah, so that's how we feel things.
Exactly. But then the brain sends signals back down, telling the muscles to move, even controlling things like your heart, lungs, bladder, all that.
Okay, starting to see how vital the spinal cord is.
Seriously vital. And it's protected, by the spinal column, those vertebrae. 24 bones in the neck, chest, and lower back, plus the sacral and coccygeal bones down below.
So where does the injury part come in?
Well, damage to the spinal cord, it disrupts those signals, those messages going back and forth. And the location of the injury, that's key. The higher up the damage, the more widespread the effects.
Okay, so like neck versus lower back makes a big difference.
Huge difference. Injuries up in the neck, the cervical region, we're talking tetraplegia, sometimes called quadriplegia, arms and legs affected.
And breathing too. Right.
Often, yeah. So think about diving. Right off the bat, someone with a high cervical injury will need a lot of assistance, breathing, moving in the water.
Makes sense. And lower down, say, the thoracic region.
Thoracic injuries usually result in paraplegia, so mainly the legs and trunk are affected. Arms and hands usually function normally.
Then lumbar and sacral, those are the lowest sections, right?
Yep, those injuries impact the hips and legs, but with sacral injuries, people can often still walk.
Wow, so we're talking about a real spectrum of abilities here.
Exactly. And it's not just the level, it's the type of injury, too. Dr. Downs talks about complete versus incomplete lesions. Complete means the nerve pathways are completely severed. Incomplete, some fibers are still intact.
So incomplete, there's a chance for some signals to get through.
Right. And then there's this ASIA grading system. It classifies the severity of the injury from complete loss of function to normal function.
So every spinal cord injury is unique.
Absolutely. It's like a fingerprint. And that's so important to remember when we talk about scuba diving with an SCI.
Okay, so we've got the basics of SCIs. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty. What are the complications, the things to watch out for when someone with an SCI wants to scuba dive?
All right. Well, the most obvious one is loss of motor function, right? Weakness or paralysis, whether it's paraplegia or tetraplegia, it affects mobility. And I don't just mean walking around. I mean every aspect of diving, getting to the dive site, moving on a boat, handling equipment.
Right, and then actually propelling yourself through the water.
Exactly. Then there's loss of sensation. Might not sound like a big deal at first, but think about it.
Yeah, I guess if you can't feel pain, you might not notice an injury.
Right. Pressure sores from gear rubbing, burns from hot equipment, you might not feel it. Even something like getting a foot stuck in a wetsuit, you wouldn't know until it's too late. And get this, some people lose positional awareness of their legs underwater. They could be dragging along the seabed, damaging coral without even knowing it.
Wow, didn't think of that. All right, what else?
Breathing, especially with those cervical injuries, the higher ones. Water pressure can make it harder to breathe.
So monitoring breathing is crucial, right?
Absolutely. Some divers might even need mechanical ventilation. And then there's bladder dysfunction, super common with SCIs.
I can imagine that would be tricky underwater.
It is. Some people have reduced sensation of fullness, others need catheterization. Emptying the bladder before and after diving, that's essential to prevent kidney problems. And, fun fact, being in water actually makes you pee more. It's called immersion diuresis.
Okay, good to know. What about muscle stuff?
Yeah, so spasticity, muscle spasms, deformities, they can all affect diving. Imagine trying to use hand signals when your muscles are spasming.
Yeah, communication would be a nightmare.
It can be, but here's a cool thing. Dr. Downs mentions that being in water often eases spasticity. It's a temporary relief, but still.
Okay, so the water itself can be therapeutic in some ways. What about pressure sores? Those are a big concern, right?
Absolutely. Prolonged pressure, especially for people with reduced sensation, it's a recipe for sores. Frequent position changes, special pressure care mats, the whole dive team needs to be on top of this.
And I've heard that people with SCIs are prone to osteoporosis.
Yeah, rapid bone loss, it's a risk, especially during those transfers in or out of the water, putting on and taking off heavy suits. Fractures are a real concern.
Okay, so a lot of physical considerations. What about things like body temperature?
Right, so regulating body temperature, it can be tricky, especially with injuries above T6. The body might not sweat properly or generate enough heat in the legs.
So hypothermia is a risk.
Big time. Might need thicker wetsuits or even heated garments. But get this, overheating can also be a problem. If they can't sweat, they can overheat on the surface.
Wow, so it's a balancing act.
Uh.
Okay, anything else we need to worry about?
Well, depression's more common in people with SCIs, so that's something to be aware of. And then there's autonomic dysreflexia, AD, we call it.
What's that?
It's a sudden spike in blood pressure. It can be triggered by, well, lots of things. A full bladder, bowel problems, tight clothing.
So even a too tight wetsuit could be a problem.
Yeah, and it can be dangerous, even life-threatening. Headache, flushing, sweating, slow heart rate.
Sounds scary.
It is. Everyone on the dive team needs to know the signs, know what to do. It's a medical emergency.
Okay, noted. Anything else?
Well, latex allergies are more common in people with SCIs because of all the medical procedures they might have.
Yeah.
And latex is in some dive gear. Seals, bungees, gloves. Got to create a latex-free environment.
Right, that makes sense.
And then there's medications. Some meds can interact with diving, so a doctor who knows about diving medicine needs to be involved.
Makes sense. What about things like implanted devices?
Yeah, those are tricky. It's often hard to find out if they're safe for diving, what depth they can handle. Manufacturers and doctors don't always have that info.
Okay, so a lot of potential complications to consider. But let's talk solutions. How do we make scuba diving safe and enjoyable for people with SCIs?
Well, it starts with logistics, transportation, for example. It needs to be accessible for wheelchairs, manual, electric, even those transfer wheelchairs for airports.
And accommodation.
Ground floor is ideal, or at least reliable lifts and ramps. Bathrooms need to be adapted too.
Makes sense. And what about actually getting to the water, getting on the boat?
Right, so accessible parking, firm ground for wheelchairs. Ideally, the boat itself would be adapted for people with disabilities, but those are still pretty rare, unfortunately.
I can imagine. So what else is needed at the dive site?
Pressure care mats for sure. Plenty of space to handle equipment. Lifts or hoists might be needed to help with water entry and exit. And beach wheelchairs for sandy areas.
Right. Every little detail matters. What about the latex issue?
Gotta be vigilant. No latex in any equipment. And the support staff, they need to use latex-free gloves too.
And we can't forget about osteoporosis.
Yeah. Those transfers, putting on suits, everything needs to be done with extra care to prevent fractures.
And then there's the body temperature thing. How do we manage that?
Well, thicker wetsuits or heated garments might be needed to prevent hypothermia. But we also need to be careful about overheating on the surface, donning suits in the shade, that kind of thing.
Okay, what about communication underwater? Hand signals might be tough for some people.
Right. Full face masks with comms units, those can be a game changer, especially for high cervical injuries. Clear communication is essential for safety.
And propulsion.
Yeah.
If your legs aren't working, how do you move around?
Well, upper body strength is key. Swim gloves can help. Some people use monofins or even diver propulsion vehicles, those little underwater scooters.
Those look fun.
They can be, yeah. but got to consider the cost, battery life, all that.
Right. And buoyancy, that must be different too.
It is. If the legs are hanging down, it creates drag, can damage the reef. Ankle weights or special buoyancy compensators can help with trim. And because fatigue is a factor, shorter dives are usually better. Maybe just one dive per day.
And we got to remember that increased urination thing.
Immersion diuresis. Yep, got to remind divers to empty their bladder after the dive.
So constant supervision is a must, right?
Absolutely. Trained support staff right there in the water the whole time.
Okay, so let's talk specifics. What level of diving is actually achievable considering all these factors?
Well, Dr. Downs mentions these adaptive scuba training agencies. The HSA, the Handicapped Scuba Association, they have a 3-level certification system.
Okay, tell me more about that.
So level A, that's for divers who can handle all the skills independently, just like any certified diver.
Makes sense?
Then there's level B. That's for divers who can dive safely and manage basic emergencies, but they need 2 buddies who are level A or higher because they might not be able to help another diver in trouble.
Okay, so a little more support needed.
Right. And then there's level C. That's for divers who need more assistance with basic skills. So they need 2 buddies. One has to be a really experienced diver, like a dive buddy or rescue diver.
Got it. So it's all about matching the certification to the individual's abilities.
Exactly. And those adaptive training agencies, the IAHD, they offer similar programs too.
Okay, so we've covered the training aspect. Now let's talk gear. What kind of equipment can make diving easier for people with SCIs?
Okay, well, for getting around the dive site, standard mobility aids are key. Wheelchairs, crutches, all that.
What about buoyancy?
Ankle weights can help to counteract the buoyancy of legs with limited muscle tone. Clip-on weights, they're good for fine-tuning balance.
What are those called again?
Clip-on weights, or sometimes they're called bright weights. And then there are weight harnesses. They can be more comfortable than a traditional weight belt, especially for people with stoma bags. And for legs that tend to sink, leg floats can help.
Okay, and what about moving around in the water?
Swim gloves are great. They give you more surface area to push against the water. Monofins can be helpful for people with one functional leg.
And those underwater scooters, you mentioned those earlier.
Yeah, the DPVs. They can help with propulsion, reduce fatigue, but they can be pricey, and battery life is a factor.
Right. What about those body-worn propulsion systems I've seen online?
Yeah, like the dive booster. It attaches to the thighs, but they're not for everyone.
Okay, so lots of options. What about masks? Anything special there?
Full face masks, they have some real advantages. For blind divers, they allow for spoken guidance through a comms unit. They can also make a better seal for people with weak facial muscles.
And they're good for communication, right?
Exactly, especially for high SCI divers who can't use hand signals easily. But a word of caution, they're not recommended for people with seizure disorders.
Okay, good to know.
Yeah.
Emergency equipment, that's a given.
Absolutely. First aid kits, oxygen. But Dr. Downs also stresses the importance of trauma shears for cutting away a wetsuit quickly in an emergency.
Makes sense. What about modifying existing gear?
Oh, yeah, there are lots of ways to tweak things. Rerouting BCD inflator hoses, using buttons that are easier to press, securing regulators with bungees, getting dive computers with big buttons, and custom-made thermal suits, those can be really helpful.
I can imagine. Now, one last thing on safety. Decompression illness, the bends. Is that a bigger risk for SCI divers?
The research isn't totally clear on that, but Dr. Downs recommends erring on the side of caution. Diving on nitrox, but treating it like air, avoiding mandatory deco stops. Slower ascents.
Good advice. Okay, so we've talked about all these practical considerations, but before anyone jumps in the water, there's that crucial step, right? The medical assessment.
Absolutely. Dr. Downs makes it clear, someone with an SCI is very unlikely to be able to self-certify. They need a doctor's approval, and not just any doctor.
Someone who specializes in diving medicine.
Exactly. And unfortunately, diving medicine isn't always a big part of medical school, so finding the right doctor can be tricky. The assessment itself can take time, and it can be expensive. And it's not just about the SCI, it's a full medical checkup.
Okay, so finding the right doctor is step one. What happens during the assessment itself?
Well, Dr. Downs lays out a general approach. First, they gather information about the person's medical history, their abilities, their limitations. Then they research the specific condition, consult with a dive doctor who knows about diving with disabilities.
And then the actual medical exam.
Right. And if everything looks good, they move on to confined water training. That's in a pool or a controlled environment. And finally, if it's safe and appropriate, they do open water training dives. Certification only comes after they've mastered all the skills.
So it's a thorough process.
It has to be. Safety is paramount.
Now, you mentioned something earlier about additional medical skills that dive instructors might find helpful. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so while instructors aren't medical professionals, Dr. Downs suggests that certain basic skills can be really useful. Things like taking blood pressure, measuring temperature, assessing peak flow rate and pulse oximetry, checking blood glucose levels, doing a basic neuro exam, even using an otoscope to look in the ears.
Wow, that's a lot.
It is, but these skills can help instructors monitor the diver's health and provide valuable info if a medical issue comes up. He even mentions where to get the equipment, pharmacies, online medical supply stores.
Okay, so let's talk about the less fun stuff. Insurance and liability. That's got to be a big consideration.
Huge. In the UK, rescue and treatment are usually free, but that's not the case everywhere.
So in other countries, you need insurance to cover rescue, treatment, even getting flown back home if necessary.
Exactly. And standard travel insurance, it might not cover pre-existing conditions, or it might have limits on diving activities. So gotta check the fine print, make sure there's enough coverage.
What about the dive staff themselves?
Professional liability insurance is a good idea, even for volunteers, just in case there's a lawsuit.
Yeah, better safe than sorry. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, but can we go back to the different types of SCIs for a minute? I'm still a bit fuzzy on how the specific level of injury affects what's possible in terms of diving.
Okay, sure. So Dr. Downs, he actually provides these handy summary guides for different SCI categories: high cervical, low cervical, thoracic above T6, thoracic below T6, and lumbar.
So he breaks it down by the level of the spine.
Yep. For each category, he talks about the key things to consider: motor function, sensation, breathing, bladder management, communication, transfers, thermal regulation, propulsion, equipment control, AD risk, monitoring, and the level of support needed in the water.
So it's like a cheat sheet for each type of injury.
Kind of, yeah. But he's very clear that these are just guidelines. A thorough individual assessment is always necessary.
Makes sense. Okay, so we've got all this knowledge now. How do we put it into action? What's the next step for someone who wants to help make scuba diving accessible for people with SCIs?
Well, Dr. Downs recommends internships with experienced adaptive diving providers. Hands-on experience is key.
Makes sense.
And he emphasizes the importance of communication, problem-solving, teamwork, and a strong relationship with the dive doctor. Knowing how to assist with gear, weighting, propulsion, doing risk assessments, understanding insurance, all that is crucial.
So it's not just about passion, it's about having the right skills and knowledge.
Exactly. And having access to the right equipment, adapted gear, mobility aids, all that. But at the end of the day, it's about enabling people with SCIs to experience the underwater world, the freedom, the weightlessness. It's incredibly rewarding.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the main takeaway for our listeners?
I think it's this. Scuba diving, it's actually possible for many people with spinal cord injuries, and the research suggests there might even be therapeutic benefits.
But there's a big but, right?
Oh yeah, it's not something to take lightly. It takes meticulous planning, a deep understanding of SCIs, and a dedicated support team.
Couldn't agree more. This deep dive has been eye-opening. It really shows that limitations are often just perceptions. With the right knowledge and support, amazing things are possible.
Totally. It makes you think, what other perceived limitations can we overcome?
Now, there's a question for our listeners to ponder. If you're intrigued by this topic and want to explore further, Dr. Downs' guide actually mentions some online resources, videos, quizzes, even a feedback form. And of course, there are organizations like the HSA and IHD. They're doing incredible work in this field.
It's worth checking out. You might be surprised what you discover.
All right, folks, that's a wrap on this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.
We hope that you have enjoyed and learnt something about the possibilities of scuba diving after a spinal cord injury. If you wish to read the guide mentioned in this podcast, there is a link to enable you to download it in the description below. Our next podcast will be about scuba diving with Down syndrome. We hope that you will join us. Safe diving!